Welcome back, everyone, to episode 2 of my reaction series to Extra History's Catherine the Great. If you didn't see yesterday's episode 1, there's a link in the description below, as well as the link to the original content creator. I encourage you to support them and everything that they do. Also, I am back to making daily content on my gaming channel. Link is in the description for that. I did my first episode of a new series on Grand Tactician the Civil War as the Union. So if you're interested in such things, check that out. Let's go ahead and dive right into part 2.
Two carriages strain against the muck and mud of the Eastern European plains. Inside, a girl and her mother sit, traveling incognito, under assumed names. Each day takes them closer to Russia. Each day takes them closer to destiny. For the first time in her life, Sophia was celebrated as someone special. Upon her arrival in Russia, the local fort fired its guns in her honor. People whispered of her presence as her sleighs chased the court from the Winter Palace to Moscow. When they caught up with Elizabeth's court, they were greeted by ministers, and then, to Sophia's delight, Peter himself. His fish-like appearance, nervous disposition, and his tendency to babble had not abated at all since they met when she was 10, but he was enthusiastic to see her, and her heart soared at the prospect of such a regal match. Then they were led in to see the Empress. Sophia was overwhelmed by the dazzling splendor. Never in her life had she seen such majesty. And so the ensuing days passed with her at Peter's side. And with each passing day, she learned a little bit more about how boorish and unconcerned with his position Peter was. He told her about how much he loathed Russia. He barely even spoke the language, instead preferring German in all things. He hated the culture and the religion.
So isn't this interesting? And this is something that happens throughout history, where you've got a German and potentially a German. She was born in what today would be Poland, but she was German. You have Germans, if they marry, who are going to inherit the throne of Russia. Well, this kind of thing happens all the time. The British royal family is very much German, going all the way back to, first they were French with William the Conqueror. He was French. When the Normans take over, the Anglo-Saxons before them, the Saxons were German. And then you have the Plantagenets, who are French. They were the Angevin dynasty, is what they were known at the time, which was from Anjou in France. So they were French. And then you get the German dynasty of Hanover, where George I and George II, both of them, their first language was German. And then when Queen Victoria, who is part of this Hanover dynasty, she marries a German. And so their children are very much German. And so it's been kind of that way. Many of these royal families aren't what they were. The House of Bourbon, which ruled France, the heir to that throne today is Spanish. So it's a very common thing.
Planned to remain a Lutheran. He even told her that he did not love her, and rather was in love with someone else, but was resigned to marry her because his aunt wished it. Meanwhile, Sophia began to realize that it wasn't Peter she had to please, but rather the Empress, Elizabeth.
And not only that, but Peter isn't really going to be a match for her as far as, Sophia, a.k.a. Catherine the Great, she's concerned with power and influence. She's not necessarily quite as concerned about having a great husband, which is why their marriage isn't going to last very long in terms of him being on the throne. Because she sees the opportunity here. I don't know if this is something that happened right away or if it's something she only saw after she got into power and in position to take power, but she obviously did pretty quickly.
She took rapidly to her study of Russian and the Russian Orthodox faith. This pleased Elizabeth, but Sophia took to her studies almost too much, staying up late at night in the harsh Russian cold to continue her practice. Soon she fell ill. Elizabeth herself rushed to nurse her, but it was pneumonia. Not many survived that disease in those days, and her recovery was made all the more difficult by the doctor's insistence on bloodletting. For weeks she lay at death's door, but as the sickness burned through her, rumor of how she contracted the disease spread. Her love of Russia, for that's how everybody perceived her ardent studies, was...
And so then the question becomes, how much of this is legit and how much of this is propaganda? Look at how much this German girl is embracing our culture. She wants to be one of us. She loves it. She loves us more than the heir to the throne loves us. So already there's this salesman job going on to sell people on Sophia.
Made known, and she became beloved, even as she slipped in and out of consciousness.
Slick.
Then came a moment where everyone thought it was the end. Her mother requested a Lutheran priest, but Sophia, with what little
Russian.
strength was in her,
Orthodox.
asked for an Orthodox priest instead. And rumor
She knows how to play the game. Now, I'm not saying that this wasn't serious to her and that she didn't mean it, but man, either way, she knew how to play the game.
of this washed throughout the land. But even as Sophia's esteem was rising, her mother's came crashing down. Shortly after Sophia recovered, a series of letters that Johanna, Sophia's mother, had sent were intercepted. The King of Prussia had asked her to help him displace the Russian diplomat Bestishev.
Talked about in the last
Elizabeth's
episode.
court, and at this she failed spectacularly. Vastly underestimating her opponent, she got caught sloppily speaking ill of him, the Queen, and Russia. Elizabeth's ire was in...
You can't do that before the marriage. I mean, at least wait until after they're married and everything is sealed, and give it a little bit of time before you start this.
tense, and Sophia sat within the blast radius. A courier burst in on Sophia and Peter while they were playing and told Sophia that she was to pack, that she was to be sent away immediately.
While they were playing, let's talk about this for a second, about how old they are at this point. So the attack of pneumonia and all this stuff happens in 1744. So this would be when Sophie or Sophia is 15 years old. And they're married in 1745 when she's 16. But it's another 17 years after that before they come to the throne of Russia.
Luckily, before her exile, she managed to get a moment with Elizabeth and humble herself before her. Elizabeth's fury
Playing the
abated,
game.
and she decided
Knows
that
how.
the child could still marry her nephew. She even allowed Sophia's mother to stay, although her standing at court was greatly diminished. Elizabeth even accelerated things, pushing forward Sophia's formal conversion to Russian Orthodoxy so that the official betrothal could take place. But at the dinner after the betrothal, Johanna exploded in an outburst when she was not seated at the table reserved for royalty.
Somebody do something about this mom. She is wrecking everything.
Saying that she would not be seated with mere ladies of the court. Elizabeth obliged her and sat her in a totally separate room by herself. With Sophia...
Yes. That's how you handle it. You don't play her game. You don't give in to her temper tantrum. You punish her for it. I love it. That's great. I like Elizabeth a lot.
conversion to Orthodoxy came a new name. She was rechristened Ekaterina,
Ekaterina.
or as we know her in English, Catherine. After this, Catherine spent her days in the royal life, dancing, attending court, going to balls, simply counting down the days until the wedding. But then tragedy struck. Peter was laid low with smallpox. Catherine waited nervously for news. Eventually, Peter recovered, but he was disfigured, his already batrachian features now marred by the scars of the disease. The first time Catherine looked upon him, she was horrified. But the illness also stirred a resolve in the Empress Elizabeth. The realm needed an heir. There was no time to wait, no time to risk
Get
some
married.
other...
All right, I know he's ugly now. He was ugly before, but now he's really ugly. Hurry up and get married, you 16-year-old. We need kids.
horrible malady. And so, Catherine and Peter were married. The affair was grand, full of splendor. Catherine's dress was of the finest make, and she was decked out with jewels. All of the highest and most notable members of the court were there. There was dancing and revelry, and then, at last, the ladies of the court escorted her to her bedchamber. There, not knowing what to do, she waited alone. And she waited. And waited. 2 hours later, Peter showed up, reeking of alcohol, and crashed onto the bed, passing out in an instant. At last, her marriage had freed her from her mother, but now...
You know what relationship this reminds me of? It reminds me of Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots, who we know famously from the time period of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, is married briefly to the King of France, but then he dies. And so then eventually she comes back to Scotland to reign as the queen. And she ends up marrying this guy, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, who basically, from the moment they get married, she hates him and probably has him murdered. And it reminds me a lot of that relationship.
Now Catherine had a new humiliation and torment. Her husband showed no affection for her and spent all of his days playing buffoonish children's games.
So I love this. If you ever go to Plymouth Plantation, I think it's called Pawtuxet Plantation now, in Massachusetts, where Plymouth Rock is, that whole thing. They have kind of a living history place there, and eventually I've got a video that'll go up about that, my visit to that. I just haven't had a chance to edit it yet. That's one of the games they play, is that thing with the wheel, and you have to, you have the stick where you have to try and keep it going. It's a lot harder than you think. My kids were better at it than I was.
Days playing buffoonish children's games, making his servants dress up like soldiers and march around his room. Even when Peter was eventually made to give up such things and sleep in the same room as his wife, rather than be with her, he would wait until dark when their governess was gone, and then take out his toy soldiers and have one of the maids move them across the bed as he ordered them about. This continued for 7 years. Then Catherine met a rakish young nobleman, far more knowledgeable in the ways of love than she. At first she resisted his advances, but eventually she gave in. Soon after, she was pregnant. She suffered through 2 horrible miscarriages, and then, finally, a son was born. Whispers abounded as to the son's actual parentage, and though in both looks and temperament he seemed Peter's son, and not any of the young lovers Catherine had taken, the matter would never be settled conclusively. But that didn't really matter, for as far as anyone official was concerned, Russia now had an heir. And so life moved apace, with Peter and Catherine living separate lives with separate loves, with their little court outside the halls of power. Then Elizabeth died. All of a sudden, Peter was made emperor, and life changed.
Now this is, it seems like a short amount of time based on how they're telling the story, but it's 17 years, I think. It's 1745 when they get married. It's 1762 when Peter comes to the throne.
In
Not there very long.
1762, he took the throne, and one of his first orders was to reverse his aunt's military policies. For years, Russia had struggled in the 7 Years' War, that same war that kicked off the American Revolution, and...
Yeah, so good point here. Let's talk about what's happening in the rest of the world. 1762 is the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. This is when you're going to start seeing the build-up to the American Revolution. We are very close to the start of the French Revolution. We're about 40 years away, 35 years away from the Napoleonic Wars kind of getting started. This is a majorly consequential time in world history.
Through doing so, eventually led to Bolivar. Russia had exhausted innumerable men and material trying to break the might of Prussian arms. After so many years of fighting, they were on the verge of success. Prussia was nearing utter collapse. Berlin itself was on the verge of falling.
And the whole point of this match with Catherine and Peter was to try and bring closer ties between Russia and Prussia at the expense of someone like Austria. And there had been an attempt before that. I think Elizabeth, who was the previous, the Empress, had tried to marry Charles Augustus, or maybe it was his brother, and he died. But whatever it was, they tried to make a match before this 30, 40 years earlier, and it didn't work out. Let me take a look. I want to get that right. Okay, so yeah, it was Charles Augustus of Holstein, who was the eldest son of Christian Augustus, is who she was supposed to marry. But he ended up dying in 1727 before they could get married. So, that kind of was a blow to that attempt to bring closer ties between Russia and Prussia.
Then Peter offered Prussia peace, giving back everything that had been won by Russian sacrifice and strength of arms. It was the second miracle of the House of Brandenburg. It saved Prussia and Frederick the Great, but it sat ill with the Russian people. It sat even worse with the Russian military and nobility. Catherine was horrified. Peter was more concerned with his title as Duke of Holstein than being Tsar of Russia.
So this is interesting because you have a Russian Tsar who's really German, who does something really favorable to a very weakened Prussia, and like I said, it bails Prussia out. But for all intents and purposes, if you're Russian, especially Russian nobility, you're looking at this and you're thinking, why did we just shed all this blood? Why did we spend all these resources just for this German to come in and throw our country under the bus. And you have another German, his wife, who takes the side of the Russian people. And so this is really going to be a turning point.
He had just given up on the most important war in the world in order to turn all of Russia's might against Denmark so that he might restore some small claim of the House of Holstein that they'd lost years before. And though some of his domestic policies were progressive and hailed as necessary reforms, for the most part, Catherine watched him blunder from one alienating act to another. Even during the funeral of his own aunt, while Catherine showed herself to be the model of orthodox humility and respect, Peter didn't even make an effort to appear to care about Orthodox customs and made a mockery of Elizabeth's funeral. He would go even further with his contempt for the church, trying to secularize all church property and even demanding that clergy shave their beards. But it really was the campaign in Denmark that doomed him. Such an act, so completely disconnected from the interests of Russia, showing such complete disregard for the honor of the army.
And this is... all throughout history, you'll see this. There are certain rulers that just are completely out of touch with what's going on in their kingdom, in their empire. Louis XVI is a perfect example of this, completely out of touch with what's going on. Tsar Nicholas II, clearly out of touch. And you could argue how much of that is the people around them, insulating them from what's really going on or misleading them in some way. But inevitably, people who are completely out of touch end up losing their kingdoms.
Or even the well-being of its men was one step too far. And more foolishly still, against the direct counsel of Frederick the Great, the very man who he so admired and whose peer he now considered himself to be, Peter let this little war pull him away from Moscow, to remove him from the center of power and the court. Soon a plot began to form to replace Peter. And at the center of that plot was his replacement, his wife. Join us next time
for a
coronation and a queen.
Oh, man, it's getting good now. Can't wait to get into the next part of this. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and we'll see you again tomorrow with part 3. Thanks for watching.